Florida Star is more than just a newspaper. It is a historical black press newspaper originating in Jacksonville, Florida. It is owned by pioneering media legend Clara McLaughlin. Paper is circulated to over 30,000 readers via route drivers who drop them off to over 200 stores, including mom and pops, barber shops, gas stations, and big box stores such as Walgreens, Walmart, and Dollar General. Locals can also purchase them in restaurants such as Jenkins Bar B Q in downtown Jacksonville and the Voo Swar in Atlantic Beach. Editors, photographers, and the latest technology create an incredible newspaper of national, state, and local news each week. Clara McLaughlin also owns and publishes the Georgia Star newspaper. The newspapers did not pause or stop publishing during COVID. As a matter of fact, it ramped up its activities and sent its sports journalists to cover the Super Bowl for the first time. Papers also cover a range of sports and African American athletes, which can be found online along with other features, news, and important information. Various online platforms allow the Florida Star newspaper to reach all of Duval County and the world via its website, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Business model for the newspaper are through selling print subscriptions. In addition, newspapers are sold for $1 on newsstands. The company also relies heavily on printed ads. Growing way the media company drives income is through bundling print ads with digital ads on its various online platforms. Clients are given a rate card which details costs and ad specs for print and digital media. The Florida Star is unique in that it also has the popular Impact radio show to cross-promote its articles and ads. The show runs twice a week on 2 stations in Duval County.
The largest, oldest, and most read African American newspaper in Northeast Florida and South Georgia.
The Florida Star is a member of the primary organization representing the black press, the National Newspaper Publishers Association. The Florida and Georgia Star newspapers stand in a long line of black newspapers that has changed this country for the better. Why is it important to support and do business with the Florida Star newspaper, an African American newspaper and member of the black press?
We didn't exist in the other papers. We were neither born, we didn't get married, we didn't die, we didn't fight in any wars, we never participated in anything of a scientific achievement. We were truly invisible unless we committed a crime. But in the black press, the Negro press, we did get married. They showed us our babies being born. They showed us graduating. They showed our PhDs.
For over 150 years, African American newspapers were among the strongest institutions in black America. They helped to create and stabilize communities. They spoke forcefully for the political and economic interests of their readers while employing thousands. In the early 19th century, African Americans were routinely vilified in the pages of the mainstream press and had no way to respond. But by the winter of 1827, an outraged community had had enough. Free blacks gathered on Varick Street in Lower Manhattan and decided that they too would use the press as a weapon. They pooled their money and started the first newspaper in the United States to be published by African Americans, Freedom's Journal. Chosen as the editors of Freedom's Journal were 28-year-old John Russwurm, one of the first black graduates of an American university, and 32-year-old preacher Samuel Cornish. 2 years after its founding, Freedom's Journal closed, following a dispute between Russwurm and Cornish over the direction of the paper. It was short-lived, but Freedom's Journal paved the way for 24 other black newspapers published before the Civil War. The most influential of the pre-war papers appeared in 1847, with abolitionist leader Frederick Douglass as its editor.
No more.
As slaves, African Americans were forbidden to read. But after the Civil War, reading became one of the sweetest fruits of freedom. For many, black newspapers were an introduction to the power and the magic of the written word.
It was their first opportunity to use the written word without fear of reprisal.
It is admitted by all that we should now be a unit of action in business as in politics, and in every way we can strive to build each other up. Does one of our own farmers want merchandise and a colored man has it to sell? Let him that wants give to his own color the preference. A plow made by a black man tells more than 100 first-class speeches. The Arkansas Freeman, October 5th, 1869.
I would rank the 19th century African-American press as one of the major forces in producing one of the major miracles of that century, pulling African-Americans together after slavery into cohesive communities. Whether you're talking about Kansas or Mississippi, New York, doesn't make any difference, Washington. These newspapers informed people, elevated morale, built a sense of racial consciousness. You can't overstate the importance of newspapers.
In the first 20 years of the new century, airplanes, automobiles, radios, and moving pictures revolutionized communications in the United States. Newspapers were in the vanguard of this revolution, feeding the nation's growing appetite for news and information. Between 1900 and 1910, over 2,600 newspapers were published in the United States, more than at any time before or since. Black newspapers sprung up to serve growing communities, from New York to the new cities of the West. In 1910 alone, over 275 black newspapers were in print, with a combined readership of over 500,000. Some, like the California Eagle in Los Angeles, had a new and radical vision of what a paper could be.
It told people how to get jobs. It told people how to get housing. It helped people actually settle in Los Angeles and make it a community.
He first tried in Chicago to be a printer. That's what he was trained to be at Hampton Institute. But becoming a full-time craftsman as a printer was simply impossible because of racial discrimination. He next tried law school. And in fact, he graduated from law school. He was the only African American in his class at law school.
He was discouraged from entering the practice of law. He was told, you're too dark to make an impact on a white judge. And he turned to journalism.
And in 1905, established the Chicago Defender, which he started from his landlady's dining room table. And then he went outside and sold the newspapers himself. And he built the paper up from nothing. And by 1910, he had a going concern.
The first issue of the Chicago Defender, with a press run of 300 copies, appeared on March 4th, 1905. With the showmanship and hyperbole that was to make him a fortune, Abbott heralded the four-page paper as the world's greatest weekly. The Defender was sold in Chicago and the Midwest on consignment through individual agents. As the orders poured in, Abbott made a decision that would change his fortune and shape the future for thousands of others. He sent the Defender into the South, home to 90% of the African-American population. There, the Defender had a potential black audience nearly 200 times larger than in Chicago, an audience that was hungry to hear what Abbott had to say. Robert Abbott, the shrewd marketer, asked for help from the one group of African-Americans who traveled freely through the South.
Robert Abbott had a real problem. How could he circulate his paper in the South? So he goes out to the railroad yards, to one of the most distinguished professions in the black community at that time, the sleeping car porters. And he hands them bundles of his newspapers, which they hide in the train. And as these trains roll through the South, instead of being put off at the stations like they used to be, which are in the town limits or the city limits, these porters will step out between cars or at the back of the train, toss them out in the countryside, and suddenly all these southern cities found they couldn't stop the black newspapers, no matter what they did.
Within a decade, the Defender outsold every African-American newspaper in the country, and Robert S. Abbott, the son of former slaves, was on his way to becoming the most powerful black man in the nation. By 1920, the Defender's circulation soared to over 100,000. Each copy passed through the hands of at least 5 readers, and Abbott's paper and its message reached more than 500,000 African Americans each week.
Robert S. Abbott became the first black millionaire to become a millionaire as a publisher of a newspaper. All before him had a mission, and that mission was not necessarily to make a lot of money. But Abbott found out that you could make some money.
The black press represented this sort of separate world in which black people live, where they could be liberated from images of inferiority that prevailed, that permeated, were reinforced by what was taught in schools or shown in mainstream newspapers or in the movies. And they also gave them an opportunity to establish their own image, their own identity, and to tell each other what they thought of themselves separate from that mainstream.
Between World War I and World War II, African American newspapers guided their readers through a rigidly segregated world. The papers provided information that was mundane, but critical for African Americans' survival. Display ads suggested where they could shop without risking humiliation. Classified ads told them which employers did not discriminate. Sports and society pages lauded the athletes and professionals who the mainstream press ignored. At a time when jobs were unavailable to blacks at mainstream papers, black newspapers were a training ground for African American lithographers, pressmen, and typographers. For artists and writers, black newspapers could be an important launching pad. Author and poet Langston Hughes was a newspaper correspondent in 1937. Pulitzer Prize winner Gwendolyn Brooks wrote poetry for the Chicago Defender while still a teenager. And the celebrated artist Romare Bearden began his career as a cartoonist for the Afro-American in 1936. The black press also trained a legion of photographers who shaped images of African Americans through their own lens. An expanding African American community turned newspapers into profitable businesses and major employers. The larger papers had their own printing presses that would get the papers to their own delivery trucks, which would put them in the hands of an army of eager newsboys. Some papers, like Marcus Garvey's Negro World, were short-lived, but others became dynasties. The Scott family's Atlanta World grew to be one of the few black daily newspapers. The Baltimore Afro-American, started by the Murphy family in 1892, would continue to be published by the Murphys more than 100 years later. Between the wars, a new black press emerged. Many papers had both political and economic strength. The Amsterdam News in New York, the Norfolk Journal and Guide in Virginia, and the paper that, after World War I, would surpass the circulation of the Chicago Defender, Robert Vann's Pittsburgh Courier.
During World War I, the Pittsburgh Courier was just another black newspaper. There was nothing exceptional about it. It was a small newspaper. It was of no real significance in the country. There were a lot of black newspapers that were the same size. Robert Vann wasn't particularly radical. After the war, though, he saw the chance to start making his newspaper bigger. He wanted to earn more money, and he did several things. One of them is he started the first national black newspaper.
Vann was a politician, statesman, publisher, and a brilliant lawyer, a severe taskmaster. There was only 2 ways to do things for him, and the right way was always Vann's way. He was a hard man to reason with, but Bob Vann was a visionary. He could see around the corner.
He wanted to help his people, but in helping his people, he also helped himself.
After Roosevelt was elected in 1932, Vann was rewarded for bringing black voters to the Democratic Party with an appointment as an assistant attorney general. He continued as publisher of the Courier, enhancing the paper by hiring many of the best minds in the country. The radical intellectual W.E.B. Du Bois shared space as a columnist with the conservative George Schuyler and with Marcus Garvey, the leader of the Back to Africa movement. Writer and folklorist Zora Neale Hurston wrote for the Courier. At its height, the Courier had 15 columnists, more than any other paper in the country.
The Courier represented power for black people, and we never had any power. And so the Courier represented something entirely different.
By the end of the 1930s, black newspapers had reached new heights of circulation and influence.
I was greeted by a waitress who shook her head, meaning no service, I soon found out, the minute I sat at the counter. "I can't serve you a Coke or anything else," she explained. I asked to speak with the manager. He snarled. "Everybody knows I don't serve Negroes in here. You must be a stranger, because if you lived in Clairton, you'd know better than to come in here and sit down."
And when I went home at night, I was just so hurt I would cry myself to sleep. But then I knew to be a hard-nosed reporter and to do my share for the cause. I felt I was doing what I needed to do.
The civil rights movement made African Americans more visible to the rest of the nation, and big advertisers began to see black papers as a way to reach out to black consumers.
Florida Star was founded by Mr. Eric O. Simpson in 1951 to cater to Jacksonville's African American community. It is the oldest and largest African American newspaper in Northeast Florida and Southeast Georgia. 50s and 60s, it was one of the most significant forces championing civil rights in Jacksonville, pressuring the government to adopt reforms, endorsing black political candidates, and keeping its readers apprised of boycotts and sit-ins. The Florida Star is now a newspaper with a broad focus on black issues. The current owner, Clara McLaughlin, purchased the paper in the early 90s from the Simpson family and has kept the newspaper thriving with her strong desire to use communication as a source of information and power for African Americans.
One banker one day said to me, "I really want to help you, but I need to speak with the man in charge." I said, "I'm the man in charge." So, what can you do? During that period, we were talking about black power. And how can you have power and all you can do is work at a station or work for the media? You had no power. And my attitude was, it's not black power, it's communications power, because it's the strongest thing there is. I'm Clara McLaughlin, owner and publisher of the Florida Star and the Georgia Star newspaper.
And when I look at Ms. McLaughlin and think about all of the things that she has done, when she went to Howard University, they did not have a school of journalism. This woman is responsible for bringing a school of journalism to Howard University, a university that is well known throughout this nation and this world. But this is the little lady with all of that mics. She continues to make strides here in Jacksonville. She is a mentor to so many young people who want to go into journalism. But you know what? She's a mentor to me. Not only because of journalism, but because of the person that she is. And she is a mentor to all of this city, and we are just so thankful. And I am so happy to be able to present this to you today. Clara, to you.
Here, here.